Thank you for joining us tonight in a beginning of an exploration of the Siddur and of the practice of Jewish prayer. And I want to make a slight disclaimer that there is some overlap between the meditation class that we're doing and the prayer class that we're doing, of course, because meditation is the prayer that comes before prayer. And when we understand what prayer means, then that phrase will make more sense. But before we talk about prayer, I want to take a step away to talk about two issues that are, I think, the main factors, the main ingredients in our prayers. Of course, that's besides for the human experience. The two ingredients are words and God. Prayer is, at least in the common practice, for better and worse, prayer involves the saying of words. And prayer is apparently something relating to God. And so I want to talk first about those two things, words and God. So let's talk first about words. We'll talk more about words in the future, but just as a general issue, words are a paradox. On the one hand, language is the tool that humans use to express thought. At the same time, it is a cumbersome tool. It's an awkward tool for expressing thoughts. It's so hard, it's impossible actually, to grasp the totality of the soul of the idea that is being expressed through simply the words. That's the case even when two humans are talking to each other. When we say words, there is we could call it a spiritual idea that we're trying to convey. And we put that, encode it into language. The other person receives that encoded message, those words, and tries to de-encrypt them or to decode them, and then translate it back into their own spiritual idea or experience. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that when we use words, we are not all of us adept, and not at all times are we really skilled at choosing the words that best express the spirit that's in our heart or in our mind. And besides, words themselves, as I said, are not such a great tool for capturing the whole of an idea. And words, of course, have multiple definitions and connotations, and words carry baggage with them. And so the first, we want to acknowledge just the challenge of learning about something so deep and spiritual, such as endeavoring to create a connection and to be open to divine reality. These are things that are hard to put into words. And then, of course, the prayers themselves, part of what I hope to accomplish, or what we hope to work on together during this time, is to look deeper into the words and to try and tap into the soul behind the words, and to connect to what is the spirit that these words are trying to bring us to. So that's intention number one. As a matter of practical practice, the way in which halacha invites us to pray is in saying the words out loud, or saying the words such that our ears hear what our lips utter. And that's a practice of bringing the ideas into the body, and to try and let those ideas be expressed in the fullness of the human experience. So if it's just reading the words with our eyes and thinking about them, that doesn't capture the fullness of the experience. The other, and more to speak about this a little bit differently, one of the things that we're trying to accomplish here is that, as the sages say, piv v'libo shavin, that our mouth and our heart should be in sync. And this is, of course, a practice all the time. We want to be sincere when we speak. And we want that our words should accurately reflect what's going on inside of us. And so, very often, prayer has become the practice of the correct reading of Hebrew words, or even of English words. And so that's a given, that we're reading the words. But the real work is in bringing the heart into sync with the words that we're saying. So some of us see prayer as a meditation, and they would be invited to bring that into piv, bring that into the physical utterance. And others see the prayer as Hebrew reading, and they would be invited to bring those words into their heart. Okay, so that's introduction number one. Introduction number two is God. This is a problem. And this is something, again, that we focused a little bit on in the meditation course, but I want to put it into this context. The word God is used in all sorts of contexts. It's used by various religions and belief systems. It's used in different cultural contexts. Again, we're talking about a word, right? So the word has so much baggage because of the many contexts in which it's used. It's also used by people of varying degrees of spiritual awareness. Just even think to ourselves, we used the word God as children, and now we use the word God as adults. Does that word still carry the same connotation for us? And so that's something to dig into. But given the fact that the word God is used by lahavdil, idol-worshipping cultures, and is also used by those who really seek to be servants of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there is a risk and a danger that there is some transfer of harmful or untrue connotations that come with that word. Look, the society we live in is interconnected. The norms that we have are influenced by those around whom we live. And the majority of the world that we live in does not have the full, at least not in the conscious way, they don't have consciously the same definition of the word God that we, B'nai Yisrael, do, and the Torah does. And so there are these transferred characteristics in the definition of the word God, and there are holdover characteristics from more primitive times and from more primitive times in our own spiritual development. And by the way, part of the danger, in the Talmud speaks of the Yetzer Hara, the allure that idol worship had for the Jewish people. People were drawn to idol worship. And it seems to me that might find place in our life today, even in the modern era, where incomplete definitions of the word God can still be very meaningful and very inspiring to us, or they can feel meaningful and inspiring, but they don't necessarily reflect the truth, the fullness of the reality that the word should evoke within us when we're thinking of that term. So I think just as a general preface, we want to think about what is the Jewish idea of God and how can we work on cleansing ourselves from these non-Jewish or incomplete definitions of that word. Now, yeah, you have a question, a comment?
I triggered a question within me. I'm sorry. I was going to keep quiet. Was Moshe's concept of God the same as Abraham's?
Okay, so this brings me to the next point, which is that to a certain degree, the descriptions that we use, the imagery that's used in the process of prayer is partially an evolution, or some refer to it as a ladder, where we go from one understanding of divine reality to a deeper and more full understanding of divine reality. So that's part of the overall journey, daily journey in the Tefillah, in the prayer process. So that's why I said that there's both untrue definitions of the word God, and there are also incomplete connotations. There are connotations of the word God that don't convey the fullness of the divine reality. So one aspect of the divine reality, one way of looking at this is, or one kind of litmus test, if we're going to speak in the philosophical sense, is, and of course prayer is about bringing the philosophical into the personal, right? Prayer is not a study of philosophy. It is the transformation of our perspective. It's a journey of consciousness, not a review of information. And so one let's say one, just so now we'll just speak in the philosophical sense. When a definition of God speaks of God as an entity, as a thing that exists somewhere, and some of you were here on Shabbos, I mentioned this, something that exists somewhere, that can't be the truth of the divine reality, because of course God, when we and again, every time I use the word, I'm a little uncomfortable, because even using the word God indicates some entity, because of course every word refers to a specific thing and not another thing. That's a particular problem with words as it relates to this subject. But of course, the truth is that everything, before there was anything, there was God. And now that there appear to be things, God didn't move, God didn't go away. Or in the way that the sages of the Midrash said, the world, he is the place of the world, and not that the world is the place in which he is found, or the place that he exists, right? If you want to see this idea reflected in the Siddur, page 28 in the Artscroll Siddur. This is in the morning prayers. And these are kind of this is the prayer before, part of it is the prayer before prayer, where we try to identify the reality of what we mean when we say God. So you want to look on page 28 and 29 in the Hebrew English Artscroll. Atta Hu ad shelo nivra ha'olam. It was you before the world was created. Atta Hu misha nivra ha'olam. It is you since the world was created. Atta Hu ba'olam hazeh. It is you in this world. V'atta hu la'olam haba. And it is you in the world to come. So the first phrase, it is you before the world was created, it was you after the world was created, seems simple enough, but it's so profound, because it says the same you which was before the world was created, it's the same you after the world was created. And in a Kabbalistic work, the subtext there is described as saying there is no change in the godly reality once the world is created, which is to say that all of the world is still godly reality. And so this is kind of a big idea that I think is very different from some of the instinctive thoughts that people have about God. Or another idea that I want to maybe push back on a little bit is the idea that God helps me, right? If I say that God is helping me, then there is me and God. And God is sort of acting on me, right? Where in reality, I am only because God is wanting me, is willing me to be. So or because there is no me outside of God, is a more maybe inclusive way to speak about it. There is no me outside of God. At the same time, our experience is a real thing. And so we experience ourselves as individuals and as separate beings from each other and from divine reality. We have our own reality that doesn't feel divine at all. And this is the work of prayer, which is to transform our reality into a more divine connected, a divine oriented, and a reality that reflects the reality that God, that our reality should be one that reflects the truth, which is that everything is a godly choice. Everything is of Hashem. And again, so I acknowledge the problem of language, words in expressing these ideas. Okay, let's take a pause and ask if anyone has questions. Robin has a question. Go ahead.
I don't have any problem with the second sentence and the succeeding sentence, and I don't have any problem with where I come from and where you come from and where the world comes from. I just have a problem with the first sentence.
Which sentence?
Atta Hu.
So you have a problem with the sentence, it was you before the world was created. What's the problem?
I want to know how something could exist with nothing.
Downstairs, right?
That way. Turn right and then left.
Take a right?
Yeah. Yeah.
We say, I just want to know where, who came from, where.
Right. So the question is, so this is the big question, who made God, essentially, right? This is the question. So when we, and this here, we're getting to the heart of the issue. It's an important question. When we think of that question, who made God, is evidence of this holdover attitude in which God is a thing. So this takes, in order to really, so first of all, we have to recognize that just like words are a crude tool, but they're the only tool that we have, human consciousness is the place in which prayer happens. And human consciousness is not capable of really understanding the nature of existence. Because of course, in order to understand the nature of existence, you'd have to have something to compare it to. And we don't have anything to compare it to. That's problem number one. Problem number two is that we experience ourselves as entities separate from other entities. But rather, I'd like to think about maybe one way that I find it helpful to think about it. And I hope that my words are consistent with the truth, is if we think about the context of reality itself. So maybe to use an example, if you have the canvas upon which a painting is painted, right? But if we think about that in terms of simply reality itself, time, space, not even time and space, but the very fact that something might exist, being itself, exists in a context in which being can emerge, right? That context is something which is beyond the human mind's ability to grasp. And that is a godly, that is perhaps the deepest definition that we could have for the divine reality. Now, that isn't to then. Now, when being emerges from context, that being is still part of, is not separate from context. You can never remove a thing. You can't differentiate between a thing and its context. However, our perspective seems to separate between a thing and its context. So, in that sense, we can say that we might be able to use that as a mashal, as an explanation, as an analogy, because of course it doesn't capture the fullness of the idea, to speak about how. So when you ask, when did the context start? The context is timeless. The context is infinite. The context is so, and also when we talk about infinity, we think in terms of vastness. But the truth is, the context is even more essential than vastness. You can't refer to that context as vast, because vastness is already something that emerges from that context. Right? So that context, that divine reality, is at the essence of everything. And it is a oneness that we all share. Right? So again, to ask that question, where did that come from, is not a question that works. So the work of, yes, it's
Say no, you can't have it.
huh? You can't. To have it would be to not have it. To answer this question would be to not answer it. To say, here's where God started, means that you're not talking about the divine reality. You're not talking about the ultimate. And I will say this.
It just goes against the way our minds work.
Yes, it goes against the way our minds work. And yet, we want to have some sense of the beyond, right? Some sense of the beyond. But the beyond is also within us. We are within it. Both. Okay.
We always want to find out how, why.
Okay. And again, the how and the why, we want to find out. You said we always want to find out how, why. It's true. How and why is part of the human reality. And that reality is something which emerges from the divine reality and is still within it. And so we refer to that as a creation of God. But actually, it's never separate from God. It's something that emerges within reality itself. And I think one way, just to go back to this issue of the word God, one way that I found helpful to think about this differently, to help me get out of these primitive ways of thinking, is to think about two realities. One is my individual personal reality, and the other is to think about reality in its totality. And that's the divine reality. So when I'm alone, when I'm separate, and on that spectrum also exists selfishness, and all sin is ultimately an expression of selfishness. That is the human reality that is ignoring, concealing the divine truth, the divine reality of the everything, and of the context in which everything exists. I want to go to our online participants, of which we have a few, Baruch Hashem, and invite any questions or comments from you all. Geula, you're unmuted. Does that mean you want to ask a question or make a comment?
Yeah, I want to make a comment, but I don't know how to unmute myself.
You're unmuted now, so go ahead. Oh, now you're muted again. I'll click on ask to unmute. Now push the button. There
Can you
you
hear
go.
me?
Now I can hear you. Go ahead.
But I can't see you. Okay. You said that before prayer, we prepare ourselves for prayer in order to warm up to it. And we mentioned that God was and is and will be forever. Isn't it repetitious when we say the same thing in Adon Olam and Igdal and Hodu and everything else? Is the same thing repetitious again and again in different words.
Very
As
good.
poetry, it's gorgeous. It's magnificent. It's beyond.
Right.
But you know what? I wish that it is not has to be of course each person who made this poem they were geniuses and the description is magnificent. It comes to reality of what God is for me. But is it really necessary to repeat things over and over and over and over again?
Okay. That's a great question. And
Of course, each one has a different style. Maybe different people may like one more than the other, but they're all the same.
right. So
If
what
you
I want,
understand, if
very
someone
good.
understands the words.
Excellent question. So part of what I hope to cover in this study is to identify how the entire Tefillah is a program, is a guided meditation meant to take us from point A to point D, that is point A, B, C, and D, and then back to point A again. So there is a process of mind. Yeah, sure, close it. You know how to close the door? Press your foot on the lever on the bottom. You see it? There's a process that the mind goes through in which we evolve our consciousness from one way of thinking about reality and about our relationship to the divine truth, and then to a deeper and deeper and more pervasive and more full interpretation of the divine truth, or a more full consciousness of the divine truth. And so I think one question to ask is, why is Adon Olam placed in the order of prayers where it is placed, right? And you know, I don't know that I'm not on the level to be able to know the meaning and the import, the purpose of every word and every paragraph. But what I hope to do, and this is a lifetime work for me, and I hope to apply myself to that work, but to understand that there's a trajectory here. And so that's something which has been helpful to me in alleviating some of the apparent repetition of the prayer, which is to realize that it seems like we're saying the same thing over and over again, but once we learn to identify certain themes, we'll see that there's nuances in the way we're referring to God that are different and deeper. And this brings me again to the idea of another definitional issue, and that is the word prayer, right? So the English word prayer is problematic. We're back to words and definitions. The English word prayer is problematic because the word prayer means to beg. That's what the literal word prayer means. I pray of thee. I beg you. Do me a favor, right? That's the word prayer. Beseech, same thing. The word tefillah in Hebrew has two definitions. One is from the word lifalel, which means to stand in judgment. And the other is from the word tofel, which is to connect, to attach. And so these two definitions describe the intention, the procedure, or the goal, which is to stand in judgment, which means to accurately describe reality. That's what a judge does. accurately describes reality. And then ultimately to be attached and to be connected with that reality. To identify myself within that reality. And that's the fullest form of attachment, is not to say that I am connected to God, but to identify myself within God. And to identify the God within myself. Not a God within myself, but to identify the divine emanation, to identify myself as a divine emanation. And that's the ultimate goal of the process of tefillah. So again, we're here to accurately describe reality and then to attach myself, to identify myself within that fullness of reality. That's tefillah lefalel, to judge, to stand in judgment, and tefillah as litafel, to attach. So that's the procedure that we go through the whole tefillah, through the whole prayer. I want to turn back to one more prayer, to one more tefillah, or one more meditation, which is in the daily prayers, and this is one of the first which we say. Page 18 and 19 in the Artscroll English Siddur. Elokai, my God, Neshama shenosata bi tehora hi. The neshama which you have placed within me is pure. Now, we start with the word God, my God, and soul. And then we speak of, so this prayer is a meditation. It's not so much a prayer. And it goes in the direction of D to A, meaning we're identifying a reality. We're identifying the fullness of truth, and we're connecting it deeper and deeper with the human experience. My God, the soul which you placed within me, which ultimately causes me to live, tehorahi, is pure. Now, when we say pure, we're referring to the fact that our existence emerges as divine reality. In this level, there is no differentiation between, there's no selfishness, there's no separateness, there's no room for impurity, there's no room for the tainting by human limitation. This recognizes that at the root of my existence is pure divinity. Atta virasa, you brought it to creation, which in Kabbalistic language refers to, gave it consciousness. Atta yitzarta, you formed it, which in Kabbalistic language refers to, you gave it feelings.
So there's a difference between bara and yatzar.
Yes. Bariya, creation, refers to consciousness. Yetzira refers to feelings. And remember, with consciousness, so before you asked a question, Robin, about the problem of where did God start? And we acknowledge that ultimately we have a problem, that human consciousness can't understand, can't grasp the fullness of reality, can't touch that which is outside of reality. This meditation opens up by saying, actually, within us, there is a truth that is higher than our consciousness. Tehorahi, higher than our consciousness. You created consciousness. From that, or let's say another way of saying that is, from that everythingness, from that pure, emerged consciousness, and that's still you. From that consciousness emerges feeling, emotion. That's still you. Atta nefachta bi, you breathed it into me. That's life. That's still you. Nefachta bi is the experience of life. So we have the consciousness, we have feeling and emotion, and then we have the physical or the human reality in which that lives. And that refers there to the physicality of life. The Atta Mishamra Bikirbi. And you maintain that the fact that that dynamic continues to exist is still within the eternity of the divine context. And this reality that we experience right now is not permanent. It's not real. It's real, but it isn't ultimate, because it will ultimately be disintegrated. This Beria Yetzira, this creation of consciousness, formation of emotions, and implementation into action is just a putting together of things which later can be restored back to eternity, back to context. Once that maintenance stops, once that emergence stops emerging, we go back into the eternity. But so that will be taken away. But there is something phenomenally eternal about what happens in this context. You hear what I'm saying? There's something phenomenally eternal about what happens in this context, meaning we're saying on the one hand that it's not going to last forever, but on the other hand, what happens is eternal. What happens here is eternal. The mitzvahs that we do, the life, that when we engage this process which happened, this consciousness, feeling, and action into a recognition of the divine reality, which is a miracle, that we are able to leverage the concealment of truth, the concealment of the purity, into the awareness of purity, of our connection, of our presence within divine reality. That's something that's eternally beautiful, such that it deserves to be restored in the time to come. This is a meditation prayer. It's so, but now to Geula's point, this is the opening of our prayer, because this is the prayer before prayer. It's Birchot HaShachar. It's the introduction to prayer. And so this is the moment in which we kind of setting the intentions. This one paragraph isn't enough to bring our consciousness to awareness of this. Right? This is, in a sense, Geula, the Tefillah, the procedure of Tefillah follows this four-step process, where we're going to go from the human experience, from the nafachta bi. We're going to work through, then we're going to step into the emotional experience, the atzarta. Then we go into the higher consciousness level awareness. And then finally, we hope to be merged and to be aware of how the fullness of reality is really Hashem. But so here we're kind of declaring our intentions. We're setting the goal. This is what I'm about to do. So it's kind of, this is part of how we wake up our mind with this prayer. And then from then on, puts us in our place. It wakes up our mind. It sets the intention. Okay. So, meaning, so some of the prayers are really, let's go. Now, the truth is that Yigdal is disputed whether it belongs in the Siddur. Not everyone has the custom to say it. But nonetheless, and specifically not in this placement. Some would argue that it doesn't really belong in this part, but in form, it's very similar to Adon Olam. So maybe that's why it ended up there. But the truth is that it has important similarities. Again, when we talk about the truth of, meaning what we talked about in the beginning about the word God, right? That's expressed in Yigdal. It's expressed in Adon Olam, right? So, but at the same time, this is kind of awareness, mind awareness opening. Okay, so that's what I wanted to. That's kind of the introduction. So what did we say today? Number one, we have to acknowledge the difficulty with words. Number two, we have to be aware of shedding problematic definitions that come with the word God. Number three, recognize that prayer is about identifying reality and identifying myself within that reality, and going through a process by which we raise our consciousness to be more connected with the truth of the divine context of everything. And that when we understand the definition, the inner definition of the words, we can begin to identify, hopefully, the process, kind of the different stages that go through the morning ritual of Tefillah, and we can have we can be more conscious in our journey, in our spiritual journey, and hopefully that our mind would be invited to follow our utterances, and that our utterances would also be consistent with what goes on in our heart.